So this is an opportunity to introduce some ideas with participants from all 4 of the grantees in a group setting. So we're going to do some more of these group TA meetings in the future. We'll have some additional webinars that help to bulk out some of the introductory ideas that we're going to present today. So I'm going to just spend a quick moment on housekeeping. Everyone was muted on entry. We are hoping to keep lines muted today to minimize any issues with feedback and echoes. So if you do have a question, please submit it into the chat at the bottom of the WebEx screen. We will have team members watching that, and we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any tech issues, we'll try to address those immediately via the chat, and we'll save the more substantive questions about content until the end. That's when we'll read aloud the submitted questions and answer them. So again, please do stay muted throughout the presentation to limit any tech interruptions. As you might have heard a moment ago, I'm recording today's meeting so that we can share it with any of your team members who couldn't attend, or for folks who want a recording to turn back to. And with that, let's begin. Emily, could you go to the next slide? So here's a high-level presentation of what we're going to try to do today. In a moment, I'll spend a couple of minutes doing introductions, and then we'll get to the main content. About half of the time, we'll introduce and motivate Bayesian interpretation of impact estimates. And then the latter half of the time, we'll focus on components of TPP programs. And at the close of the hour, we'll have a Q&A block, and we'll follow up with links to the slides and a recording of the presentation in the future. Next slide, Emily. All right, so here's who's presenting today, and you can see our faces here and in the video. So John Dakey is a senior fellow at Mathematica with over 20 years of experience designing impact evaluations, developing evidence standards, and providing technical support to other evaluators. Recently, he's been focused on using Bayesian methods in the context of impact evaluations. Marielle Finucane is a principal statistician at Mathematica. She has 7 years of experience leading quantitative policy analyses, with a particular focus on Bayesian methods, impact evaluation, and primary care delivery. Emily Labreco is a new researcher at Mathematica and a member of the TPP Evaluation Technical Assistance team. She has experience using component analyses to identify the drivers of substance use prevention programs and is helping to develop a series of resources for describing components of TPP programs. And I'm Russ Cole. I'm the PI on this project. I've been doing evaluation technical assistance for over a decade with OPA TPP grantees. I've been working with Emily on the program components work for OPA and have developed some of the earlier versions of work in TA briefs that we'll include links to at the end of the presentation. All right, so with that, let's begin. So why are we here today? Our primary goal as TA providers is to help you all conduct compelling, rigorous effectiveness evaluations, and that's obviously your goal too. We're also hoping that the impact evidence that you produce is statistically significant and favorable, assuming the program works, since many audiences focus on this, including the old teen pregnancy prevention evidence review, which was recently revived. But there's more that you can do in your impact evaluation than estimate program impacts and do a traditional inferential test. We're hoping that in today's webinar, you see some opportunities to go beyond what you might have done in the past. You can enhance your standard presentation of the magnitude of the observed impact and the p-value for the inferential test with a Bayesian posterior probability statistic to provide additional decision support around your impact estimate. And you can plan on describing the components or the ingredients of your intervention to better articulate what your program is, the effective contrast that you're testing, and potentially do some supplemental analyses to link individual components to outcomes. So both of these ideas are things that may play a role in the future of the evidence review. So we wanted to get them on your radar now so that you can plan accordingly. We will loop back and we'll do additional webinars on these topics next year in advance of when your analysis plans are due, so that you have everything that you need to lay out how you might potentially go beyond the basics of doing a traditional inferential analysis. So again, you'll hear more about this in the remainder of today's introductory presentation. And with that, I'm going to pass this to John and Marielle to begin their work with Bayesian interpretation.
Great, thanks so much, Russ. Really appreciate it. Really glad to be here. As he said, this first half is going to be John and me presenting on this framework that we have developed. We call it BASI, and BASI stands for Bayesian interpretation of estimates, and it's really for interpreting impact estimates from rigorous policy evaluations. Slide. Today, we will be talking about when and why we think this framework can be helpful. It's going to be a pretty brief introduction, and then we'll come back with more details in the future, tell you more about the theory underlying the framework, and also get very practical and present to you guys this spreadsheet tool that we've developed that would let you use this framework if you're interested in your own research. Slide. Okay, so first off, when is this a framework that might be helpful to you? We have these two use case scenarios in mind. In the first one, you can imagine that you're the one conducting an impact evaluation, and you've already done a lot of the legwork, right? You've carefully designed your study, you've collected the data, you've figured out exactly how you want to specify your regression, and you've run that regression on a computer. And now you're holding the output from that computer program in your hands. You have an impact estimate and a standard error. And this step right there, where you need to interpret that impact estimate, is where Bayesian comes in. Remember that the I in Bayesian stands for interpretation. So you have this impact estimate, you need to interpret it. You're wondering what to make of this impact estimate. And in particular, what's the probability that you've found an intervention that really does meaningfully move the needle for the population that you're aiming to serve? That's the first use case. Second use case is very similar, except for instead of conducting the impact evaluation, you're now a consumer of this research. Perhaps you're reading an evaluation report or a manuscript about an impact evaluation, and you find yourself in the same position of staring at an impact estimate and a standard error and wanting to interpret that evidence, wondering what to make of it. Next slide. Okay, so we think that at this crucial juncture, you're going to hopefully, after this presentation, want to use this Bayesian framework. And in the next part of the presentation, we're going to tell you why we think that is. In particular, why we think statistical significance testing, which is a kind of alternative way to interpret impact evaluation findings, why we think that's perhaps not the best way to go. And then John will give an example of why that is not a good way to go, what kind of information can get left on the table when that's the approach you take. And then he'll give on the other side of the coin an example of what you can learn if you instead use Bayesian. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Mariel. So the use case that Mariel described, the situation in which we would want to use Bayesian, is the situation where previously we've been using statistical significance. And just to kind of restate that again, it is we've got this impact estimate and we're trying to figure out what's the likelihood that this represents a genuine effect of the intervention, as opposed to just statistical noise that arises from random assignment or random sampling. We used to use statistical significance for that purpose, but you can go to the next slide. What we've been taught, and hit it again, by the American Statistical Association in the year 2016 is that we were misinterpreting statistical significance. So if we want to know that there's a high probability that an intervention worked, statistical significance isn't the thing that's going to tell us that. Now, a lot of organizations put out a lot of statements all the time, and it's usually not a big deal, and it goes into the ether and nobody pays attention to it. But this statement from the American Statistical Association was pretty unusual in that they never make statements. They're a very, very circumspect, introverted kind of group, and they don't talk much. And it took them a long time to gather up the courage to make this big, bold statement. And it was based on a lot of work in the journals over many years with many researchers. And they finally got together and they reached a consensus and they put out this statement. So it's not a small deal. And the purpose of the statement was to say, you've been doing this wrong. It's not what you think it means. And you could just go through the next two animations. And this was followed up in 2019. There was a special issue of the American Statistician talking about statistical inference in the 21st century. Like, how are we going to move beyond this world of statistical significance of p less than 0.05? And also in 2019, there was a big commentary in Nature in which 800 different researchers signed a statement saying we need to stop using statistical significance. Now, the challenge, of course, is that you can't turn the entire ship of research on a dime. It's going to take time. And one of the problems with statistical significance actually makes it hard to replace, which is it was this universally applied standard thing used in all types of different situations. And so now we have to figure out what to do in our specific context. And that's what Bayesian is about, trying to figure out what to do in our context. So it'll take a little bit of time to move from where we were to where we want to go. But we're setting the groundwork to do that. And so I will hand it back to Mariel.
Great. Next slide, please. Super. So John described for you guys this kind of groundswell of really nearly a scientific consensus that statistical significance testing was not telling us what we thought it could, and really can't offer the appropriate tool for interpreting evidence. And I want to spend one slide telling you guys about some of the major concerns that really supported that groundswell of publications. So why do we and why do they reject statistical significance testing? The first and perhaps the main problem is that statistical significance testing leads to overconfidence in our conclusions, where we really divide the world into black and white, into thumbs up and thumbs down, where if we see a p-value less than this totally arbitrary threshold of 0.05, we say eureka, and if we see a p-value greater than that threshold, we despair and throw our research in the trash. And the problem with doing that, with declaring eureka for p-values less than 0.05 and despairing for p-values greater than 0.05, is that a small p-value does not actually imply a high probability that the intervention you're evaluating actually works. I'm going to say that again because it's incredibly important, and at least for me was very counterintuitive the first time I heard it. So a small p-value does not actually imply a high probability that the thing that you're evaluating works. And it's really important to realize that misinterpretation of p-values, where when we see a small p, we think that it implies a high probability that the intervention works, that's not just a semantic mistake we're making, that can actually be quite a large magnitude meaningful mistake. And conversely, we really shouldn't despair when we see p's greater than 0.05, which is, of course, especially important in the context of low-powered study where sample sizes tend to be smaller. John will give some examples in a moment where even when p is bigger than 0.05, there's really still a lot that can be. All right, so that's our first reason for rejecting statistical significance. A second one, which I'm sure you guys have all heard about and thought about, is that a p-value doesn't reflect the size of the impact, which of course is incredibly important as well for determining whether something matters or not. A third problem is that the pervasive use of p-values has really created this incentive system in research that can kind of have some bad consequences. For example, using p-values can lead to publication bias, wherein only statistically significant findings show up in the literature. And then it can also lead to problems like p-hacking and data mining. I have to admit that this is something that I have done. It's just kind of baked into the current system where you try different regression specifications and kind of cross your fingers to attain significance with one of them. And these problems together, publication bias, p-hacking, and data mining, they really lead to an evidence base where what we see reported in the literature is hard to make sense of and hard to trust because we're really only seeing the things that made it through these various filters. So those are three big problems with statistical significance testing. And before I give it back to John, I want to just quickly mention that all of these problems are made more problematic when we're in the context of small studies, when sample sizes are small. So in our future chats with you guys, we'll go into that in more detail. But just today, keep it in the back of your mind that all of these problems are particularly important in small studies.
All right, so I'm going to talk about an example that focuses on one specific aspect of the problems with statistical significance. I want to set aside some of the issues. So I want to set aside the issue that the p-value doesn't exactly mean what we want it to. And let's just assume that we can calculate the probability that one group, like a treatment group, is really had better outcomes than the other group. Let's assume we can do that. And instead, let's focus on the issue of that arbitrary bright line of saying p has to be less than 0.05, or conversely, we want there to be a 95% chance that one group is better than the other. So let's focus on that issue, and let's move to the next slide. So from a completely different world than program evaluation, let's look at sports betting and the NFL. And I grabbed this screenshot from 538.com a few weeks ago. It was Sunday, November 7th. And 538 very helpfully puts up these probabilities that different teams are going to win a game. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is that there is no probability reported on this screen that is bigger than 95%. There's no probability on this screen that is less than 5%, conversely. And so what this means is that if you were to use statistical significance to inform your decisions about placing a bet on a football game, you wouldn't place any bets at all. You would say the difference between the expected scores of these teams, they're all statistically insignificant. And so I don't think any teams are winners. Everybody's a loser. I'm not going to bet on anything. If you take that view, which I don't think anybody actually does in the real world, then you're going to leave money on the table. You're going to miss out on an opportunity, because if I were to offer you an even money bet on these games, you'd, in expectation, be well advised to take that bet. And if I said that you can only bet on one of these things, if you look across the numbers, there's important variation in these probabilities. 74% is importantly different than 86%, which is importantly different than 59%. If I said, pick one of these to bet on, there's useful information for you to make that decision. And it would be much less useful if, instead of showing you these probabilities, all we said was, there's no statistically significant difference in our expectations for the scores among these teams. That would not be useful at all. So this is just to ground you in the idea that there can be more useful information than the dichotomy of thumbs up or thumbs down. And you want to pay attention to your context. How is this information going to be used? In this context, it's for placing a bet on a football game. But in a research context, of course, there are going to be some other use cases in mind. And that's important to keep in mind rather than that arbitrary cutoff.
Great, thanks, Jen. So just to orient you guys quickly, we've told you when to use Bayesian for interpreting impact estimates. We've given you a lot of reasons why we think statistical significance testing is not giving you what you need. Now we want to tell you guys a little bit briefly about Bayesian and why we think it's a good alternative. So very quickly, Bayesian is this framework. It's going to help you interpret impact estimates. And very importantly, it's going to answer that key question that p-values can't answer. It's going to tell us what is the probability that an intervention was actually effective. And it's going to do that using 3 ingredients. The first is that impact estimate and standard error from your study. The next is Bayes' rule, which is just an incontrovertible mathematical theorem. And then the third, this is very important, is prior evidence. So we're going to get these probability statements that we're really interested in. That's the big win. The big cost is that we need to ground our particular study in the context of a broader prior evidence base. So this might look like a set of studies from a similar field, or looking at similar interventions, or targeting similar outcomes in similar populations, some relevant set of prior evidence. And when you put those 3 things together, your impact estimate, Bayes' rule, and this prior evidence from the literature, that's what's going to allow you to calculate this probability instead of using p-values. One thing we wanted to quickly point out is that there's nothing methodologically new in the framework. We haven't proved any new theorems. We haven't derived any new estimators. However, nonetheless, we did give Bayesian a name. We call it Bayesian, and we did that to kind of package it up and set it apart from this broader world of Bayesian statistics. So the word Bayes gets used a lot in a lot of different contexts and fields and in popular reporting. And we wanted to be clear that Bayesian is specifically targeted and tailored for use in really rigorous, high stakes policy evaluation. And we think of it as defined as much by what it is not as what it is. And what we mean by that is that Bayesian in particular is not a framework that has any place for squishy personal beliefs. And we just wanted to be very clear about that, because for some of you, it could be the case that when you hear the word Bayes, you think that there are these squishy priors baked in. And we wanted to be extremely clear that in Bayesian, that is not the case. We do need prior evidence, but we use hard, rigorous evidence from the literature. Next slide, please.
All right, I'm going to now go through a different example. I did football before, but now I'm going to zone in on something a little more near and dear to all of our hearts, which is interpreting findings from a study. And so this is a completely hypothetical, made-up example, but it might look familiar. So here we have an intervention that I just entitled Play It Safe. And we're looking at the impacts of this intervention on two different outcomes. This is and it's in effect size units. These are the typical impact estimates and standard errors that we calculate all the time by comparing the mean outcome of the treatment group to the control group. And when we're using p less than 0.05 as our benchmark for statistical significance, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we have to say the evaluation finds no impact of Play It Safe, thumbs down, despair from Mariel's earlier slide, total failure. Even though the intervention was well implemented, the estimated impacts were statistically insignificant. But now let's go to the next slide and see what happens when we have what I think is a much more nuanced and much more informative and useful potentially interpretation. Here, instead of focusing on that bright line cutoff of 95%, which you will remember from the football analogy, made it impossible for us to understand which teams were more likely to win than others. And we lost out on the opportunity to make a good bet. Here, we can now say the evaluation finds a 90% chance that Play It Safe reduces intentions to have sex without condoms. And we can continue to talk about even more results that would be considered statistically insignificant, but now we can actually talk about them and understand them and interpret them with meaningful probabilities. We can say strong implementation may explain why there's also a 71% chance that the program reduced intentions to have sex without condoms by at least 0.05 standard deviations. And we can say that there was a 69% chance of lower rates of positive STI tests, though any effect was likely small. So this is, I hope, an example of how Bayesian can be useful in the context of actual evaluations, and particularly smaller evaluations where it's really hard to get statistically significant findings. And that's it for us today, and we'll have a lot more to say about this on a future call.
Okay. So thanks, John and Mariel. There'll be time at the end to ask and answer questions about what they just covered. So for now, we're going to shift gears and talk about our second topic, program components and component analysis. And before we jump in, I just want to be clear that we just want to illustrate some thinking about components. This isn't meant to be any kind of in-depth instruction about how to do this kind of work. We just kind of want to lay some foundation, plant some seeds for people to start thinking about if this is something you want to pursue a little bit more deeply. So to start, we want to address what a component analysis actually is. And so a component analysis differs from traditional impact evaluations in a lot of ways. So in a traditional impact evaluation, we want to assess the effects of the whole program. And usually we want to see if in its entirety, it's related to better outcomes for people who receive it versus some kind of comparison group. So for example, in this hypothetical logic model, an impact evaluation might test the impacts of this whole program in the gray box on the proximal and distal outcomes that we expect a program to impact based on some kind of underlying theory or some other evidence. This is valuable, this is important. We definitely don't recommend that anyone stops doing these types of analyses, but we don't learn everything that there is to know about a program when we do traditional impact evaluations. One thing we don't learn is exactly what about a program is related to the different outcomes, and even just what are the different pieces of a program. So for example, in this program, there were 3 separate program components that make up the whole program together. So instead of looking at the whole program, a component analysis is a way to learn about these smaller pieces of the program, which are called components. And we are able to also look at how these different things might differ from the counterfactual, and then eventually look at perhaps the relationships between these different components and specific impacts on outcomes that we're interested in. And we're talking about doing this in an exploratory way, not a rigorous way right now. So this is really meant to be more descriptive and exploratory because it's definitely in its kind of earlier stages. So in terms of the definition of program components, you probably already gathered from what we've discussed so far that these are just the ingredients of a program. So they're the different pieces of the program that together make up the larger whole. And they're usually defined or described somewhere, like in a program manual or some other kind of written documentation. More specifically, there are different categories and types of program components. And we're definitely not the first people to ever talk about program components. There was a recent National Academy of Science report which dove into this topic, and we used that to kind of expand upon and articulate 7 different types of program components. So I'm going to walk through each of the 7 types and give an example of them to kind of put them in context of TPP programs. So the first one is the content, and this is the subject matter that's provided in a program. So in a TPP program, this might look like information about condom use. The delivery mechanism is the way that the content's provided. So this could be something like a lecture. The format of the content being delivered could take on something like an in-person format, a virtual format, or it could be something like a small group format. The staffing component is the intended training and characteristics of the people who deliver that content. So this could be something like a specific training requirement of a program developer, like a 2-day facilitator training. But it could also involve prior experiences that qualify people to deliver programs. So being a teacher is a common staffing component of programs. The dosage component covers all the different types of durations and intensities of the program content. So this could be something like 6 2-hour lessons is the full dosage of a program, or it could be a little bit more specific, like this activity should take 25 minutes. The environment is the intended setting or location where a program occurs, like a health class is a common environment. And then the target population features are the intended features of the people who are meant to receive the program. So for instance, high school students or LGBTQ youth, those are 2 examples of the target population features. And then together, these 7 components produce the intended experience for youth in TPP programs. So even though I just described these as 7 things that are completely separate from each other, the truth is that it's the combinations of these program components that describe how a program is meant to be implemented. So if you think about a single activity from a multi-session TPP program, you might have something like this, a 20-minute small group activity with high school students during health class, featuring a discussion about communication and healthy relationships. So in this one single 20-minute activity, we have a bunch of different components happening. We have a dosage component, we have format, we have a target population, an environment, a delivery mechanism, and the content. So even though this is one thing, there are actually 6 different components going on at the same time. And even though we would want to implement the program that way, certain stakeholders, like program developers, might have thoughts about some of these 6 components being more essential than others to the program's impacts on program participants. So out of the whole list of program components that might be in a program, there's a subset that we might think of as being core or essential to these program impacts. But we don't know for sure if this is true until we have evidence for this. One way that we could produce evidence is through rigorous effectiveness evaluations, like doing some kind of randomized study where we have all these different components and we randomize people to different combinations of them. But let's say you're in the middle of implementing a program, you could still produce some preliminary evidence about promising components by disaggregating programs into their different components, like I did in the example last slide. And this can help produce some preliminary evidence about these components that is really useful because we're definitely kind of in a very new field, so any information is helpful. And if we do this, it will actually provide some preliminary evidence to perhaps do some of those more rigorous effectiveness evaluations. And if we do this again and again across programs, eventually we'll have enough information to perhaps make changes to improve programs or even come up with new programs that are very effective and kind of a new way of looking at program components. And Russ, I think you're up.
Thanks, Emily. Yes, so thanks, Emily, for helping us to lay out how to think about program components, the subset that are or influential on participant outcomes, and then the subset of those that have been demonstrated to be effective and that we can label as evidence-based components. There's definitely a lot there, and we're excited to share more detail about that with everyone in the future. But for now, in the spirit of just trying to get folks interested in this, we want to hint at ways that this information might be useful to you all in terms of future communication. So first off, I'm going to talk a little bit about how a description of components can help provide some additional information that can be useful in your study reporting. So presenting the components of your program, particularly the ones that you think to be core, helps your reader to really understand the conceptual drivers of your program's logic model or theory of change. Oftentimes, the descriptions of interventions in journal articles or reports is really thin, really uninformative. And being more thoughtful in laying out these components and the subset that are core can really help audiences better understand the nature of the programs that are being evaluated. Secondly, in the context of an impact study like the ones that you're all doing, laying out the components of both the treatment group and the control group's programs is really going to help you to have a much better sense and articulation of the effective contrast being tested. That is exactly what the difference is in the services or the components that are being offered or received across conditions. And better understanding this contrast may help you to understand which outcomes are most or least likely to be affected or equivalently have the largest or smallest observed impact estimates. And as more and more programs start laying out their components, practitioners may be able to use presentations of components to help them select programs that fit their needs and fit within constraints of their intended implementation settings. We think that this is a real contribution and is potentially something that will be integrated into the next round of the teen pregnancy prevention evidence review. And beyond simply creating a more transparent presentation of your intervention and the contrast for your impact studies, thinking about components may help you answer additional research questions that go beyond whole program effectiveness that Emily was talking about. So this would be like an opportunity for you to answer research questions that can supplement your impact paper or serve as a standalone dissemination product. When Emily introduced this topic, she showed a logic model that outlined how a program could be conceptualized as having 3 individual components and that those individual components were expected to influence different outcomes of interest. The idea here is that if you have data on variation in youth experiences of components, you can conduct analyses to capture how variation in those component experiences is associated with variation in outcomes. And like to just try to make this a tiny bit more concrete, you almost certainly are going to have attendance data, which is going to likely vary across youth to some extent. For example, if you're in schools delivering a 10-day program, hopefully you have attendance data for each of those 10 sessions. Those attendance data can be used to show how youth in your treatment group had different exposures to different components of interest. And the idea here is you can empirically examine the extent to which those different component experiences, where, for example, each day of lessons is considered a separate component, is associated with different outcomes as hypothesized by your logic model. So the idea is that in this exploratory space, you can find out which components appear to be most influential in pushing particular outcomes and showcase that as an interesting or innovative finding. Next slide, please. So going back to what this gets you, let's start with the first thing, the basics. What might you be able to say about your program? And this is like a course illustration. The idea is that you'll be able to enumerate a variety of different types of content, for example, that are offered as part of your program. For example, you can see here content about goal setting, content about consent or healthy relationships, condoms as a type of contraception, and so on. The idea here is that it may be possible to fully list the different types of content that make up your program. I'm going to talk about a tool that we're working on that enables users to disaggregate the content and other program component types into well-defined individual items on a checklist. This checklist captures all of the different program component types that Emily introduced, things like content, things like delivery mechanism, dosage, staffing, everything that's shown here. It's a way for you as a researcher or as a project director to really reliably report out everything that makes up your program as it's intended, and in doing so, able to communicate out all of these ingredients of your program. Next slide, Emily. And then there's that second benefit of components, linking variation in component experiences to variation in outcomes. Again, essentially, it's taking your project logic model, breaking it out into components, and doing some exploratory analyses around it. The working example from before showed this logic model where a short program was really made up of these three broad components. A discussion about personal safety and consent, a condom demonstration, and a lecture about STIs. And the expectation was that these three different components might be differently linked to outcomes. The idea that we were talking about is that you can explore naturally occurring variation in component experiences and try to do some analyses around them. So perhaps in this situation, in this study, there was variation in the attendance of that key condom demonstration lesson, that second puzzle piece. Some youth in the program attended and some didn't. If we can convince ourselves that those who attended that demonstration aren't terribly different than those who didn't attend, for example, we see that they look pretty similar to each other on survey data that we collect at baseline, there might be an opportunity to explore hypotheses around what that condom lesson does. Our logic model assumed that the condom lesson was likely to improve knowledge around pregnancy and STIs. So let's explore that and potentially uncover an exploratory finding like the one shown in this slide. So we can say like individuals who attended the condom lesson had scores on pregnancy and STI knowledge scale that were 11 percentage points higher than those who did not attend that lesson. And I feel like I'm about to have my hand slapped because I've reported a p-value. But you can actually incorporate some Bayesian interpretation even around these components, but more for the future. That's the idea. You can do some exploratory analyses to capitalize on variation in component experiences and see if your logic model is right, that certain components do appear to play a role in particular outcomes. There's definitely more to it than what I presented here, but the goal really for today's presentation isn't to get into the weeds. It's more to show the promise and hopefully get folks excited about this moving forward. So you might be saying to yourself, all right, this sounds great. I'm interested, but you haven't presented enough information for us to do this now, and that's okay. The first thing to do is to plan on attending a future webinar where we're going to get more into the weeds on this topic. So during that future webinar, we're going to introduce 3 documents that are currently in process and are being refined. One is a frequently asked questions document that lays out some of the framing that Emily shared in writing. The second is a component checklist. It's an Excel worksheet that enumerates a large number of potential components of teen pregnancy prevention programs, and it uses all of the categories that Emily presented. It's got lots of different types of content, lots of different delivery mechanisms, formats, staffing approaches. The idea is that you can go through this checklist and indicate all of the components of your program, the subset that you believe to be core or related empirically or hypothetically to outcomes of interest. Finally, there's instructions. We have instructions that are going to guide users on actually using the checklist to enumerate the components of your programs. So in this future webinar, we'll also talk about fully articulating the components of your program, including the subset that are core in your dissemination around your program and your evaluation findings. And we'll also talk more about doing those additional types of analyses that enable you to explore variation in component exposure and how that's associated with variation in youth outcomes to identify those components that appear to have some influence on participant outcomes. So what can you do now? I think the key thing is to start thinking about the components, and particularly the core components of your program. What are the most important things that define your program? What are the components that you believe to be linked to outcomes? Those are the core components. And to start to think about logic models that show how your program's individual components influence outcomes. You probably already have logic models about how your program works as a whole, but now we're proposing a thought exercise that goes a little bit finer in terms of level of detail. It's thinking about how individual components of your program are associated with outcomes, both those proximal outcomes that are really well aligned with the individual components, as well as the more distal, potentially behavioral outcomes. The other important thing to think about now is, to the extent possible, again, like thinking about that attendance data, for example, collect implementation data around components and plan on building linkages around those implementation data to outcome surveys. So for example, in that classroom setting that we talked about before, hopefully you'd have like attendance data for each student in the class, and in doing so, you might be able to link the profile of attendance data to youth outcome surveys to enable you to explore how variation in youth attendance is associated with variation in youth outcomes. Again, we'll definitely attempt to connect those dots in a future webinar, but this is the kind of like planning activities that you can do now. So that's it for us for today. We're going to stop now and turn to your questions. So if you do have questions, we encourage you to submit them via the chat. And we do have one that came in to me already. And again, I encourage folks to submit questions via chat. But this is a question for Mariel and John. It's kind of a broad question. Can you talk more about how the Bayesian interpretation can guide decision support? Don't audiences or stakeholders want something simple like a yes or no answer about whether a program works or whether a program should be funded in the future?
Sure, Russ, I can take that question. And it's a great question. It's a question we often get. And I think it's an important distinction that we should probably be more conscious of making when we're talking about Bayesian, that decisions are binary. Decisions are often yes or no. Either I'm going to implement this intervention or I'm not going to implement this intervention. Or in my football analogy, I'm either going to place a bet or I'm not going to place a bet. So decisions are often yes or no, a binary decision. But that doesn't necessarily mean that statistical significance, just because it's thumbs up or thumbs down, is the right way to answer that question. I could ask a yes or no question: should I bet on the Chiefs this weekend? And if Russ says no, but he's answering an entirely different question, like, do you like anchovies on your pizza? Then just the very fact that he's given me a yes or no answer doesn't mean that he's answered my question. So if you're asking the question, should I implement this intervention? And if you're asking someone to help you answer that question using research evidence, the way to answer it isn't to say, oh, is it statistically significant or not? the way to answer it is to then ask back, what are your criteria? What are you trying to achieve in making the decision to implement this? What are your benefits? What are your costs? What are your risks? What are your considerations? And then you can go into something called decision analysis or Bayesian decision analysis, and you can actually develop an answer that is targeted and relevant to that question at hand. So in the football example, I gave the example of like, suppose that you can only bet on one team. So what's the criteria there? Well, it's whichever team has the highest probability of winning. That would be the right criteria for that decision. But if you have another situation, it could be a completely different criteria. I'll give another example, like from the field of education. Maybe you've got a school that is picking between multiple math curricula. Well, not teaching math is not an option on the table. They're going to teach math. And so then it's just a question of which of these different curricula is most likely to work. And so then again, you're going to compare these different probabilities of intervention effectiveness and pick the one that's most likely to work. If it's 52% versus 48%, that's far away from the 95% cutoff, but that's more relevant to that decision. So it's a great point. Decisions are quite often, almost always, binary yes or no. But if you're going to make a binary yes or no decision, you need to have the statistics and the analysis lined up with the criteria being used to make that decision, not some completely arbitrary criteria that somebody literally 100 years ago came up with in the context of agriculture experiments. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So, great question, Russ.
We did have a couple more questions that come in. John and Mariel, these are both for you. We'll start with the first one that Jen asked. Will you have examples of using Bayesian for studies that may be underpowered? We've had lower recruitment and attendance than planned during the pandemic and are exploring options.
Yes, we will definitely have examples for studies that are smaller and that would traditionally be regarded as underpowered. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Mariel.
Absolutely. So I think that is really one of the settings where this framework can provide the best value add. And I think although it was made up, John's last example in our deck was a good one because in his original table, neither of those two p-values met statistical significance, which is often the big problem that we run into when we have these smaller underpowered studies where recruitment has been an issue. So hopefully that example gave some flavor of how you can still make really useful conclusions from studies that don't attain statistical significance, perhaps because of recruitment issues. But in terms of actual concrete, not made up examples that we could give right now, John, I'm thinking back to your principal professional development work. Is that an example?
Well, strictly speaking, no, because that was a pretty big study. But they did have some findings that were not statistically significant. But they were substantively important, and it was important to understand that something might have been going on, even though it wasn't statistically significant. So, I mean, I suppose that's an example of how underpowered is in the eye of the beholder. Most people would have considered that study to be pretty well powered, but that doesn't mean that there still aren't some findings that you're going to look at differently if you have a more nuanced interpretation.
And another question that came in on the Bayesian side was, to what extent does Bayesian align with WWC, and I'm going to fill in another gap, and also the teen pregnancy prevention evidence review standards? John or Mariel, do you want to speak to either of those?
Well, I could definitely say something about that. I would say it's completely orthogonal in some sense to evidence review standards. So I've worked on evidence review standards before, especially for the What Works Clearinghouse. I developed the attrition standard. I led the development of the regression discontinuity design standard. So I know something about that process. And necessarily and inevitably, it is a slow process. And it is a process that is focused on reviewing the existing literature. So there's kind of a chicken and an egg problem for evidence reviews in which they're going to focus their standards development in order to review the literature that exists, so that they can put things into different buckets. And one kind of misinterpretation that people often have of evidence review standards is they treat them as if they are textbooks or guides for like best practice in research, and they're not the opposite of that, but that's not what they're intended to do. They are intended for the evidence review to classify the existing literature into different buckets. That's job one for evidence review standards. So the evidence reviews probably will take some time to evolve in response to both the ASA statement in 2016 and then in response to ideas that people have for dealing with that statement over time, like Bayesian. So I think that one of the nice things about Bayesian is we're not replacing your traditional impact estimate or standard error. You can still report p-values and statistical significance. It is an augmentation to that. It is complementary to that. And as folks add this to their studies over time, then the evidence reviews, which move kind of slow, they will respond to that and evolve. And so, you know, I think that that is just the reality of how these things work. And so I think this is a good thing to add to your study. It's not going to hurt you with respect to the evidence review in any way, but it can make your findings hopefully more useful to broader audiences. There is a world outside of evidence reviews. There are other readers of studies beyond evidence reviews. And I think this can be useful for those broader audiences. And ultimately, we can nudge the evidence reviews in a new direction, I think.
One more quick point on that, Russ, sorry. I almost never disagree with John, but I would say it's not completely orthogonal, Bayesian and evidence reviews, because one really exciting thing about using Bayesian in the TPP context is that there is an evidence review, which is going to be extremely useful for developing these evidence-based priors that we were talking about earlier. I come from a field, I focus most of my work on primary care delivery, and there is no evidence review of previous interventions to improve primary care delivery. So for us, developing a prior is way harder than it's going to be in this context.
That's a super great point. Looking at the question from a different angle, that's a great point. This is why I like giving presentations with Mariel. She's
And
always
I just
balancing me out.
and I wanted to just kind of loop back to John's point of pushing the field forward to make an argument for evidence reviews to update their standards to take this into account. There is an increasing body of research in the teen pregnancy prevention field that is starting to show these Bayesian posterior probabilities as complementing or supplementing the traditional inferential tests. And we're hoping that everyone on this call is going to take whichever pill it is. I don't know if it's the red pill or the blue pill, but also incorporate this into your impact studies to again push the field and help push the evidence review to acknowledge that this is an important thing to consider, to go beyond statistical significance in the determination of whether a program has evidence of effectiveness or not.
And we're going to try to make it easy by giving you a nice little spreadsheet to do it. So it won't hopefully be a whole lot of work.
And there's one final question that's come in, at least thus far. We've got 5 more minutes, so folks, if you do have other questions, please do add them to the chat. The question is, are Bayesian studies publishable with p-values greater than 0.05?
Well, so I cannot speak for all journal editors, clearly. And if there is a journal editor out there who continues to enforce statistical significance as a filter in what they publish, can't control it. But I am aware of many journals moving in a direction of completely ignoring statistical significance and definitely removing it as a filter. So I think that if there is a journal, I mean, if somebody gets a referee comment or an editor comment that, oh, we're not going to publish this because it's not statistically significant, there is very strong grounds for pushing back very hard against that type of feedback. And some of those references we gave in the slides from Nature, from the American Statistical Association, are really strong supports for pushing back on that kind of thing. I'm curious, Mariel, what your experience has been with journals.
Yep, +1.
Yeah.
And just to say this, and Emily, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I remember in the brief that you were recently working on, we pointed out a number of journals that specifically highlight that they publish findings that are not traditionally statistically significant. I think Evaluation Review was one.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, by any
I
chance,
don't
recall?
remember the other one.
Okay,
No.
but
But Evaluation Review is correct.
yeah. So there certainly are journals. There's also a journal of like the null findings. Again, I can certainly follow up if folks want to have any questions about that. It's looking like the questions are drying up. Oh, excuse me. Uh, Curious if other TPP Tier 2 Phase 2 grantees will compare virtual and in-person implementation. Seems like it fits under component analysis. Thumbs up. Totally agree. It seems like exactly the kind of research question that a component analysis would enable you to explore. And we strongly encourage folks to do exactly that type of exploratory analysis. Is the program more effective under a virtual implementation setting versus a standard in-person implementation setting? And that's seems like a pretty straightforward like subgroup type of analysis that you can do, and I think that it absolutely provides a really useful answer to a question that many of us are asking ourselves. So I encourage folks to unmute themselves to weigh in on that question. It looks like Heather is saying that yes, if we're able to do in-person implementation, we will definitely look into this. Well, folks, this is great. Thanks everyone for making time today to listen to this. Again, this is kind of the appetizer. There'll be a main course next year where we'll get into the weeds for both of these topics as two separate presentations. If you have questions about any of this stuff, you can reach out to those of us shown here on our emails. And again, we will be posting a recording as well as these slides to Max in the future. Thanks all for making time for this, and happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
So long.